Before you start listening to this podcast episode, I am very excited to tell you about the new logo of Stories from Palestine podcast. It was designed by Palestinian artist Ayed Arafeh with the help of my children who made the drawings for the design. You can now also order merchandise. There are 96 different items in the webshop that you can order with a print of the logo. In this way, you are supporting the podcast financially and you're helping to promote the podcast, and you may strike up a nice conversation about Palestine with people who may see your t-shirt, your bag, your hat, your button or your sticker. There are notebooks, all kinds of clothing and many more items. It's very easy to order. Just go to the show notes of this podcast, click on the link and scroll through all the items on the Redbubble webshop. You are listening to Stories from Palestine podcast, a podcast recorded in Palestine and about Palestine. My name is Crystal. I am originally from the Netherlands and I am married to a Palestinian. We live in Beit Safafa between Jerusalem and Bethlehem, and we run Singer Cafe and Al Jisr Bar in Beit Sahur. Before moving to Palestine in 2013, I worked as a teacher and tour guide in the Netherlands. I have a degree in history and in tour guiding and many years of tour guiding experience. Due to the COVID pandemic, tourism in Palestine came to a complete halt, and that's why I started Stories from Palestine podcast in August 2020. This is the second year of the podcast, with every week on Monday a new episode about the history and heritage of Palestine, as well as the reality of life today. I hope you will enjoy today's episode. Hi everyone, and thank you for tuning in again. We are waiting in Jerusalem for the snow to arrive. It has been pretty cold weather over the past weeks, and we have had a lot of rainfall. We also last week waited for snow that never came, but now it seems that a snowstorm is on its way, and it already passed from Istanbul, and it is already in the northern part of Palestine and in the Syrian Golan Heights. And our children will be done with school earlier today so that they can be home safely and we can await the snowfall. So I thought to record this episode now that the kids still have school, because tomorrow schools are going to be off. And I hope that my kids will finally have a chance to play in the snow, because they don't really have memory of the last time they saw snow, which was in the Netherlands a few years ago when they were still super young. So it's been a bit of a strange week also because a lot of people around us are testing positive for COVID, including my own parents-in-law. So we have been kind of in isolation, quarantine, staying away from people and trying not to get infected and or infect other people. And I think most people around the world are experiencing this right now at the moment. So I'm kind of hibernating and staying home, and I do not really have a chance to do interviews at the moment. So I'm choosing to do some solo episodes. Also, that is helpful for me because the Ministry of Tourism announced that they will do the exam to become licensed tour guide somewhere later in February or in March, which means that I'm back to my studying and getting ready to do that exam. And for me, preparing these history episodes is really helpful also in remembering and restudying again the material that I have to know for the exam. So I'm going to continue for now with a series of solo episodes. And as they say in Arabic, in this way, Bidi adrub asfurain bihajar, which means I want to kill two birds with one stone. So I can produce some podcast episodes and in the same time study for this important exam. This week, I'm taking you to Caesarea, or in Arabic, Qisaria. We recently visited Caesarea, and like last week, you can listen to this episode and then click on the link in the show notes to see the YouTube video that my daughter Louisa and I made of our visit to Caesarea. And you can get a better idea of what the situation there really looks like. Or you can also pause the podcast now and first watch the video, whatever you prefer. So Caesarea is pronounced in Arabic as Qisaria, and in its most recent history, it was a village established in the 19th century by refugees from Bosnia. This was under the Ottoman Empire, and they built a small fishing village near the ruins of the Crusader fortress. They were not only known for fishing, but also for growing citrus, bananas, and cereals. And in 1945, the population of Caesarea consisted of 930 Muslims and 30 Christians. But in the beginning of 1948, Zionist militias attacked the village, and they killed and wounded several people, which made the other villagers realize that they had to run for their lives, and they were then forcibly displaced, and their houses have been largely demolished. Only a few houses remain, and the only one still standing mosque is now part of the renovated harbor area of Caesarea, where they have lots of restaurants and shops for the visitors of the national park. And on the lands of the people of Caesarea, they have now built a lot of hotels and resorts, and it is turned into a popular tourist area. That is the most recent history of that place, and obviously this is not the part of the history that is promoted at the tourist site. I think most of the visitors there don't know and don't want to know about what happened here in 1948. They come to see the historical and the archaeological site. And of course, that is also part of the history of Palestine. And therefore, I'm taking you to Caesarea to know more about the history of this place that has been there for over 2,000 years. When you visit Caesarea, you are visiting it through the national parks authorities. You have to pay an entrance fee, and then you reach to the archaeological site. We drove from Jerusalem about an hour and a half to get there. We took the road number 1, and then we took road number 2, which is up along the coastline. There are 2 other roads that you can take that are parallel to road number 2. That's road number 4 or road number 6. Road number 6 is the toll road that you have to pay money for. And maybe we should have decided to do that and we would have been there a bit faster. But we took the scenic route, and it was a bit busy because it was on a Friday afternoon, and it seems that a lot of people were going home early and we got a little bit stuck in traffic. But it is a scenic route, although we didn't really get to see the sea from the highway. Caesarea is situated about 54 kilometers north of Jaffa. That's about 34 miles. And it is about 34 kilometers south of Haifa, which is about 22 miles. So it's between Jaffa and Haifa on the coast, and it is an archaeological site directly on the beach. Caesarea was built over 2,000 years ago by King Herod the Great, and he named it Caesarea to honor the Roman Emperor Augustus. His title of honor of the emperor was Caesar, and this title, Caesar, is derived from a personal name, the name of the Julii Caesaris, which was a branch of the Julia clan, and to this clan Gaius Julius Caesar belonged, and he was the forebear of the Julio-Claudian dynasty that had the 5 first emperors, the 5 first Roman emperors: Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. And for people who are familiar with the Bible, these names may sound familiar to them because these are the ones that are also mentioned in the biblical stories. And it is interesting to realize that the German word Kaiser, actually in Dutch also we say Kaiser, it is directly related to the title of Caesar, just like Tsar in Russian, or I think also in Bulgarian and in Serbian language. Tsar is directly arrived from the Roman emperor's title of Caesar. And Herod the Great called this new city Caesarea to honor the Roman emperor because he needed to keep this friendship and good relationship with the Roman emperor, who was the one who gave him, King Herod the Great, the opportunity to rule over part of the empire. And this is not the only Caesarea in Palestine, because the son of King Herod the Great, Philip, he also built a city in honor of the Roman emperor, and he built it on the northeast side of the Lake of Galilee in the Roman province of Gaulanitis. And we can still recognize that name in today's Golan Heights. Gaulanitis, Golan Heights. Today this is occupied by Israel from Syria. And in the Roman period it was called Gaulanitis, and Philip built here a new city at Panium. Today Panium is known as Banyas or Banyas. In Arabic, they don't pronounce the P, so it's Banyas. And he called the new city Caesarea. But to differentiate it from Caesarea on the coast, he named it Caesarea Philippi. So Caesar after the emperor and Philippi after himself, Philip. And Caesarea on the coast was called Caesarea Maritima. Although in the Byzantine time it became known as Caesarea Palaestina, and it became the capital of the province Palaestina Prima. So we are going to talk about Caesarea Maritima. By the way, I found out recently that there was another city that was referred to as Dio Caesarea in the same time, and that was Sepphoris. And Sepphoris was a city close to Nazareth, which was built actually in the time that Jesus was a small boy. And some scholars think that his father, Joseph, who was, well, we always say he was a carpenter, but they think he was a tekton, which was more of a builder, somebody who worked in construction, that Joseph may have worked in that city because he was from a tiny village, Nazareth, where there were maybe only maximum few hundred people. And as they were building this new big city, Sepphoris, they may have needed some people like Joseph, tektons, to work, and that he would have built Sepphoris. But it's not mentioned in the Bible. And for some time, that city, Sepphoris, was also called Dio Caesarea. Dio meaning God, and Caesarea, as we know, was the title of the Roman emperor. So Caesarea Maritima is the one on the coast, one of the three Caesareas we know in Palestine, a city on the coast. And it's important to realize that the coast of Palestine doesn't really have any good promontories. Promontories are higher lands that stick out into the sea, headlands that create a bay, and in a bay there are less high waves, so it's easier for boats to dock. So you would have like a natural harbor, but there aren't many of those on the Palestinian coast. Apart maybe from the area between Haifa and Akka, where the Carmel Mountains jut into the sea, and maybe a bit at Jaffa, but there are otherwise not really natural promontories. So that doesn't mean that there weren't any harbors. There were, of course, don't forget about Gaza and Ascalon and Asdod. They were all important ancient harbor cities. But what Herod the Great did was something quite extraordinary for that time. He chose a place on the coast that didn't have any natural promontory, where he built a big harbor out of nothing. He chose a place where there had been a small docking station, a small naval station, that was known as Stratos Tower, or in Greek, Stratonos Pyrgos. And this had been functioning for a while by the Phoenicians, and it was named Strato after the king of Sidon. Sidon and Tyre were important Phoenician trade cities. They were north of Akka, and they used this small station as a place to dock their boats. But it was only a very small naval station back then. Herod the Great did here what he was very good at, and that was building massive structures. Well, he didn't build it himself, obviously, but he gave order to build it. And he spent all his money on building these huge buildings. We know that he enlarged the temple in Jerusalem. He built the Herodian close to Bethlehem. He had the Masada built, and I'll do an episode about Masada soon because we visited there too. He built several fortifications, and he built the whole city of Caesarea, including a harbor. And the harbor is interesting because he had to make a breakwater into the sea so that the boats could dock safely in an inner harbor. And because it was not natural, it had to be created. He imported 24,000 cubic meters of a stone called pozzolana. And pozzolana is a special mixture of volcanic ash mixed with limestone. And when you bring that underwater, it sets into the water as concrete. So it'll be so strong that it is enough strong to break the waves and to provide a safe harbor for the boats. And the harbor that he built there, he gave it its own name. So he gave the city the name Caesarea to honor the Emperor Augustus. And he also gave the harbor its own name, and he called it Sebastos. And this name, Sebastos, is Greek, and it's actually the same title for the emperor, but in the Greek language. And we already heard that in the episode I did about Nablus, when we went to Jacob's Well Church and Sebastia. And Sebastia, the name comes from Sebastos, which is the name, the honorable name of the emperor in the Greek language. Now, any ship, any boat that would sail into the harbor of Sebastos would first see a big temple. And this big temple Herod built on the shore on a higher platform. And the temple was built in honor of, I think you can guess it by now, the Emperor Augustus. You can see how much effort Herod the Great did in order to please the emperor, because he needed to be and stay and remain friends with him so that he could keep his power position. Of the temple and the platform, we can't really see anything anymore because the temple was torn down and the stones were used in other buildings over time. But on the same location of the temple, a Byzantine church was built in the 6th century. And that often happened with sacred sites in the Holy Land, that they became a place of worship for the new rulers. So later on, a mosque was built on the same location, and that mosque was again replaced by a Crusader church. So from temple to church to mosque to church on the same location. And as we will see, in Caesarea, there are many layers of civilization. And this is also very common in Palestine. In many sites, the history goes back to even further than the Roman time. And it is really interesting to walk around these archaeological sites and to see the remains of all these different eras. What else remains from the time of Herod and the following Roman era is the big Roman theater, which is actually the first thing that you see when you enter the national park. In the whole country, there are about 15 Roman theaters that were uncovered in archaeological digs. In the episode about Sebastia that I mentioned, we also visited a Roman theater, but that was a much smaller version compared to this one in Caesarea. The theater in Sebastia had a view over the hills of Samaria in the background, but here in Caesarea, the viewers would see the sea and hear the sound of the sea in the background when they were sitting in the theater. The theater itself has been renovated and changed a bit over time, but it is still in very good shape. It can host up to 4,000 people, and that was quite a big theater in that time. In the 4th century, they used to even flood part of the theater so that they could perform theater plays, including sea battles and water games. From the 7th century on, when the area became under the Arab Muslim rulers, the theater stopped being used. Actually, in that time, the whole city deteriorated. And I will talk about that a little bit later, but it probably can be explained by the fact that these new rulers came from the desert and were used to desert life, not to the life on the coast. So they didn't really focus their attention on the cities on the coast. But before we continue into later parts of the history, there is another interesting finding that was done in Caesarea, and that is a piece of stone that was found at the backside of the theater. And it seems that the stone was in secondary use, which means that it came from somewhere else and it was reused as building material. And when the excavators saw an inscription on the stone, they started to look into what was written there. And the stone was broken, so it's basically only half of the inscription. It's not complete, but they could read and understand that it said, "To the divine Augustus Tiberius, Pontius Pilate, the prefect of Judea, has dedicated this." And then we don't know what did he dedicate, but it was a dedication stone. And the most important thing, that the name Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, is mentioned on the stone. And for those of you who are familiar with the Bible, you will know this name very well, because Pontius Pilate was the one who allowed the crucifixion of Jesus in Jerusalem. The Jewish court, the Sanhedrin, they had found Jesus guilty of blasphemy, and then they brought him to Pontius Pilate, the Roman prefect, to ask him to crucify Jesus. And Pontius Pilate usually did not stay in Jerusalem. He was there only because of the Passover feast that he attended in order to make sure that there would be no riots and no problems in the city. But usually the prefects used to stay in Caesarea because Caesarea had become the administrative center of the Roman Empire in this region. And in Caesarea, he had a beautiful palace that Herod the Great had built. It was built on a small promontory sticking out into the sea, and it had a swimming pool, and there were in the city hippodrome for horse racing and bathhouses and the theater and a lot of things where you could enjoy yourself with entertainment, something that the Romans were really good in, wine and games. And in Jerusalem, where the Jewish laws were very restrictive and where there was a lot of tension and even opposition against the Roman rulers, so that was not the place where Pontius Pilate wanted to stay most of the time. So he only came to Jerusalem when it was really necessary. And he had arrived to Jerusalem because of the Passover feast. And then they brought Jesus to him and they asked him to crucify him. And eventually he agreed with that, not because he really believed that Jesus was guilty of anything, but because he didn't want to have any problems with the Jewish people. There were so many in town for the festival, for the Passover, that he thought it was better to just go with the demand of the Jewish people. And now, why is it so interesting to find a stone with the name of Pontius Pilate? Because outside of the New Testament of the Bible and a few Roman historians who mention his name, they didn't find any other evidence of his existence. So for historians, this is very important proof that this Bible character, this biblical character of Pilate, was most probably a real and existing person. The limestone block with the inscription, the original one, is now in Jerusalem in the Israel Museum. But they made a replica, and that's the one that you can see on the site. And it is placed near to the palace of Herod, where it used to be on the promontory reaching into the seawater. Now, another very beautiful remnant from the Roman times are the aqueducts. The aqueducts brought in fresh water to the inhabitants of Caesarea. And a good part of the aqueduct system is still intact, and it is literally on the beach, north of the archaeological site. It's built parallel to the shore, and it used to carry the water from its source, which was a spring northeast of Caesarea, right to the city. Originally, there was one high-level aqueduct, but when Emperor Hadrian visited Caesarea in 130 AD, he saw that the city was growing and in need of more water supply, so he had a second aqueduct built right next to the existing one. And these twin parallel aqueducts, they functioned from that time for the next 1,200 years and supplied the cisterns of the city and the public fountains with water, fresh water. And one of these fountains is nicely excavated, and you can see it in Caesarea when you visit it, and it is called a Nymphaeum. And maybe you recognize the word nymph in there, and I'm not sure if you know what nymphs were in ancient Greek folklore. A nymph is a minor female nature deity. So it's not like the main Greek goddesses, but more like a personification of nature. And these nymphs were typically tied to a specific place, originally to caves or water springs. But later on, any kind of water source, including fountains, would be attributed to the nymphs. And they were beautified with depictions of the beautiful maidens. And the Nymphaeum in Caesarea had a decorative function, so it was very beautiful. It was decorated with statues, and it provided a place for the residents to meet and a place where they could get fresh drinking water from. So we're still talking about Caesarea in the Roman time. Caesarea has grown later on, especially in the Byzantine time. But before we go to that part of the history, I want to mention that Caesarea is mentioned a couple of times in Bible stories of the New Testament. So for the Bible lovers among the listeners, there are a few stories that happened here, and this happened all in the early Roman time. There is the story of Peter, the Apostle Peter, who went from Joppa, which is today's Jaffa, and he came to Caesarea to meet a Roman centurion. The Roman centurion's name was Cornelius, and Cornelius had asked about Peter, and he wanted to know and learn more from him about Jesus and his gospel. So this pagan Roman centurion and his family became one of the first followers of Jesus Christ who were not originally Jewish. They were even baptized by Peter in Caesarea during the visit. There was another apostle who spent time in Caesarea, and that is Apostle Paul. And Apostle Paul was a Jew with Roman citizenship. He became a follower of Jesus, and he was accused by a group of religious Jews in Jerusalem that he brought non-Jewish people, Gentiles as they called them, to the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. And so they were really angry, and a mob of angry men was about to kill Paul when a Roman officer saw the scene, and he found out that Paul had Roman citizenship. And if you had Roman citizenship, that meant that you had certain privileges and protection under the Roman Empire. So they wanted to take him to a safe place and give him a trial by the Romans. So they brought him to Caesarea because that was the administrative center, and that was where the Roman governor of Judea lived. And his name at that time was Felix. And Felix couldn't really find him guilty of anything, but he kept him in the prison in Caesarea, probably because he was hoping that Paul would pay him a bribe eventually to get out, but Paul didn't. So he spent almost 2 years in the prison. And then a next governor came on the stage, and that was Governor Festus. And Festus didn't really know who Paul was and what was the situation with this guy. And Paul had asked to be brought to Rome because he said, I am a Roman citizen. I want to be brought to Rome, and I want to be trialed there in the courts of the Caesar himself. Governor Festus didn't really know what to do with him. But when in that time King Agrippa II visited Caesarea, and King Agrippa II was the great-grandson of King Herod the Great, the one who built Caesarea. So his great-grandson came to visit the new governor Festus in Caesarea, and then Festus said to King Agrippa, he said, what should we do with this guy Paul? And Agrippa said, I don't know about Paul, let me meet him. And then Paul spoke a long time with Agrippa, and according to the Bible, Agrippa then said that if he would speak longer, he may turn into a Christian. But actually, in the end, it didn't end well for this King Agrippa II, and he actually died a horrible death in Caesarea. According to the Bible book of Acts, this is what happened to King Agrippa II in Caesarea. It says here, and I quote, later, Herod Agrippa moved from Judea and went to the city of Caesarea, where he stayed. Herod was very angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon, but the people of those cities all came in a group to him. After convincing Blastus, the king's personal servant, to be on their side, they asked Herod for peace, because their country got its food from his country. On a chosen day, Herod put on his royal robes, sat on his throne, and made a speech to the people. And they shouted, "This is the voice of a god, not a human." And because Herod did not give the glory to God, an angel of the Lord immediately caused him to become sick, and he was eaten by worms and died. End quote. He was eaten by worms and died, in that order. So yeah, that was happened to King Herod Agrippa II in Caesarea, according to the book of Acts. And I do have to mention another famous person from Caesarea. He's not a Bible character, but he was a very important biblical scholar. And he became the first bishop of Caesarea. Caesarea became a very important center for Christianity in the late Roman and in the Byzantine time. This man studied with the famous theologian Origen, and Origen left a huge library in Caesarea with all his manuscripts. It was the second largest library after the library in Alexandria in that time. And the name of this famous man from Caesarea is Eusebius. And if you study the history of Palestine, you will always and everywhere read the name of Eusebius. First of all, because he wrote a book about the life of Emperor Constantine, the one who made the Roman Empire accept and later adopt Christianity. And the mother of Constantine, Helena, was the one who came to Palestine, and she ordered the construction of the Nativity Church and the Holy Sepulchre Church and another church on the Mount of Olives. So he's very known for writing that book, The Life of Constantine. Secondly, he's very famous because he wrote the Onomasticon. And this book, the Onomasticon, is very important. Until today, it's used by historians because it is a directory of names of places that are mentioned in the Bible, and then it gives their geographical locations. It is used until today to establish where stories of the Bible took place. It seems that he had access to Roman maps of the early Roman Empire so that he could record very precise distances. And the way he worked, he actually describes it himself, his own method of working like this, and I quote, "I shall collect the entries from the whole of the divinely inspired scriptures, and I shall set them out, grouped by their initial letters, so that one may easily perceive what lies scattered throughout the text." So in the Onomasticon, he had in alphabetical order the names of places from the Bible with the exact location. As well, he gave names of the places in the area around, and he gave the names also in Greek, because they were originally in Aramaic and Hebrew, but then he also gave the Greek translations. He wrote it in the year 324, by the way. And for example, by that time, Jerusalem was called Ilia, after Emperor Hadrian had renamed it Alia Capitolina. And do you remember I did an episode on all the names that Jerusalem had over time? It's an episode in season 1. So Alia Capitolina, it became known as Ilia. And for example, Amman in that time, today's capital of Jordan, was called Philadelphia in Greek in the Roman times. And in Roman time, the language that was still used a lot was the Greek language, because the Greeks, they ruled the area before. So we later see more use of Latin, but in that time still there was a lot of use of the Greek language. And for example, Akka in that time was called Ptolemais. And we can all read and know about this from the Onomasticon written by Eusebius. And Eusebius also became the bishop of Caesarea in the year 314. And Eusebius is always referred to as Eusebius of Caesarea. So now let's move on to the Byzantine time. The Byzantine time, when did it start? It started in the year 330. that is the year in which the Emperor Constantine decided to relocate the capital of the Roman Empire to Byzantium. And he renamed the city of Byzantium after himself, and he called it Constantinople. His name was Constantine, and from Polis city, it became Constantinople, the city of Constantine. And it remained Constantinople until the fall of the Byzantine Empire, which was in the year 1453. Then it was conquered by the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, and it was renamed Istanbul. So where Istanbul is now was originally Byzantium, and it was renamed Constantinople when it was made the capital of the Byzantine Empire. And in Byzantine time, the former province of Syria, Palestina, which covered the whole area between Egypt and today's Syria and Lebanon, in Byzantine time, this area was divided by the Byzantine rulers into smaller provinces. That was easier to administer, smaller provinces, and they called them, in Byzantine time, Palaestina Prima, Palaestina Secunda, and Palaestina Salutaris, or Palaestina Tertia. And I'm mentioning this because Caesarea became the capital of Palaestina Prima. And we'll talk about that a little bit more, but I also mention it because a lot of people do not realize that in history, the name Palestina was an official name for the provinces for a very long time, under Byzantine rule and later under the Arab Muslim rule when it was called Jund Philistine. So the name Palestine doesn't come out of nowhere. Just also for your information, because I had been wondering about this, what is Salutaris, Palaestina Salutaris? What is the meaning of that? We have Palaestina Prima, the first, Palaestina Secunda, the second, Palaestina Tertia, the third, but it was more often known as Palaestina Salutaris. So I found 3 different interpretations or hypotheses about the meaning of Salutaris. The one that sounds most likely to me is that it comes from the Latin word salus, which means health. And this became an addition to, in total, 5 provinces that had the name Salutaris added as an addition to the name of the province. So it wasn't only Palaestina Salutaris, there were 4 others that were called Salutaris. And this actually can be considered as a wish of health for the emperor. So the adjective Salutaris could point out that those provinces were somehow dedicated to the emperor. And the emperor was obviously seen as the protector of the empire. So in Byzantine time, between 330 and 1453, we had 3 provinces called Palaestina Prima, Palaestina Secunda, and Palaestina Salutaris. And the capital of Palaestina Prima was Caesarea. And the capital of Palaestina Secunda, by the way, was Bisan, also called Skytopolis in Greek. And today it's called Beit Shan. And then the capital of Palaestina Salutaris was Petra, which is in today's Jordan. Now, the Byzantine era was the golden age for the city of Caesarea. The city grew much bigger than it had been. They had to build new walls because they had to extend the area that was under the protection of the walls and the gates and the area where the people lived. They added a big hippodrome for horse racing, and they added a big amphitheater. And amphitheaters were used more for spectacles, for games, for fights. Unlike the normal theaters that had a stage and a sort of a background where theater plays would happen, the amphitheaters were used more for sports games and other big spectacle activities. So Byzantine Caesarea was at its largest. And then when the Muslim conquest of Palestine happened, it seems that Caesarea was first partially destroyed and then partially rebuilt. But throughout the early Muslim era, the city was in decline. The harbor silted up. There was not a use of the harbor. And this could maybe be explained by the fact that the new Arab rulers were desert people. They came in from the Arabian desert. They were not used to live near the sea. Near the sea, the area, the land is low. It's a different soil. It can often be swampy. lots of mosquitoes. It was not something that they had experience in. They didn't have experience in ship trading. So they didn't focus on the cities by the sea. And Caesarea in that time was not a main city anymore. The area under the Muslim Arab rule was divided into provinces that were called Jund, and Caesarea became part of Jund Palestine, but it wasn't the capital like it was before in the Byzantine time. Now Ramla became the capital of Jund Palestine. It seems that there was some kind of development that happened later in the decades actually before the Crusaders arrived, because by that time we read from the Persian poet and traveler, very famous Nasir Khusrau. He comes here and he writes a lot about his visits to Palestine, and he describes Caesarea in the following way. Caesarea is a fine city with running waters and palm gardens, orange and citron trees. The walls are strong and it has an iron gate. There are fountains that gush out within the city, and he notes that there is a beautiful Friday mosque, so situated that its courts you may sit in and enjoy the view of all that is passing on the sea. And he describes this in the year 1047. So that is about 50 years before the Crusaders arrive. When the Crusaders arrive, they besiege Caesarea, and in the year 1101, they take it. And the mosque that Khusrau described is then changed into a church, and it is called the St. Peter Church. So this is a Crusader church. And the Crusaders move into the city and they rebuilt it, but it is much smaller than the Byzantine city had been. And actually it's even smaller than the original Herodian city when it was built. But until today, we can see part of its city walls, and you can see that there are huge walls, and a deep moat was dug around the city walls. It was a moat without water. I'm used in Holland to see that around city walls there was always a moat that was filled with water. In Palestine, we see that most of the moats were dry moats, but it made it very difficult for attackers to reach the walls without being trapped. And part of the defense system is the entrance gate that you pass either when you enter or exit from the northern part of the archaeological site. And this is a beautiful Crusader Gate. And what makes this gate in Caesarea so precious is that it is a Crusader Gate from a later period than most of the Crusader remains that we find in the area. So it is not the Romanesque style that is heavy and fortress-like, but it is much more the Gothic style that developed in Europe, with the pointed arches and the ribbed vaults that give more of height and light and grandeur in the building style. And it is worth mentioning the name of the person who ordered the construction of this gate, because that was the only French king who was canonized as a saint by the Catholic Church, and it is King Louis IX. And King Louis IX set out on a crusade from France, but he took not the northern route around the Mediterranean, he took the southern route. So he came via North Africa through Egypt, and there in Egypt he was captured and he was taken hostage until they paid a ransom for him. And when King Louis IX was released, he actually went up to the Crusader kingdom, and he spent quite a few years, first in Jaffa, later in Akka, and he fortified many of the Crusader cities on the coast. And so he did that also with Caesarea. So what we see of the Crusader fortifications is from that time. But it wasn't long after he had that all built and renovated, in 1251, that the Mamluk Sultan Baybars managed to conquer Palestine, and he took over the cities on the coast. And as with all the other cities on the coast, he destroyed Caesarea. The Mamluks were not seafaring people. If you want to know more about the Mamluks, you can listen back to episode 1 of this season, season 5, the episode about the Dome of the Rock and the Aqsa Mosque, because Dr. Yusuf Anache explains very well in that episode who the Mamluks were. The Mamluks were not a seafaring nation. They didn't have experience on the sea. They didn't need a harbor. And they were afraid that the Crusaders would return and that they would use these cities as strongholds to reconquer the land. So they used the tactic of burning everything on the coast, and they focused more on the cities in the hinterland, the cities in the mountains. And Caesarea never became a big city again. Since the time of the Mamluks, it was destroyed and it was never really rebuilt. But as I described in the beginning of the episode, during the Ottoman time, there was a village called Caesarea, and the people who lived there were forcibly displaced in 1948, and their lands were taken from them. And one of the town's mosques of Caesarea is now part of the newly developed area in the archaeological park, where you find all the shops and restaurants. And it is striking that there is no sign there that describes the history of the mosque or what happened in 1948. The whole park is full of information signs and maps and give you all the history of the area, but nothing about that little mosque. And unfortunately, that is not very uncommon, because the Israeli narrative has a big blind eye for that part of their history. I will share some maps and photos and videos on social media and on the website for you to have a better idea of what Caesarea looks like. And of course, you can watch the new video on the YouTube channel with my daughter Louisa, taking you on a tour in the archaeological park. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and thank you for listening. Thank you for listening to Stories from Palestine. If you enjoy the podcast, then here are several things you can do to support the show. Tell your friends about the podcast. Share some of the social media posts on Instagram or Facebook. Start following the YouTube channel. You can also hear the podcast audio there. And soon I will start uploading videos. Sign up for the email list so that you get a reminder with a clickable link to the new podcast episode. And in the future, you will be updated about programs and trips that I will start to organize. And of course, you can donate to help me pay for hosting the podcast and the website and all the related recording costs. It's the only source of income I have at the moment, so you can imagine how much I appreciate every cup of coffee or falafel sandwich that you buy me on the Ko-fi platform. All the links that you need can be found in the show notes and on the website storiesfrompalestine.info. That's it. I hope you will tune in again next week. If you enjoy listening to Stories from Palestine podcast, then I think you will also enjoy listening to my favorite podcast, which is called Jerusalem Unplugged. You can find it on most podcast players and on social media at Jerusalem Unplugged.